Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. My name is Sergeant Jackson Knight, a combat medic in the 22nd Expeditionary Force. I never expected to write this. No training prepares you for an enemy that defies logic and nature. I'm not sharing this for recognition, but because people need to know the truth, no matter how unreal it sounds. Our unit was deployed to Thornhaven Valley, a war-torn wasteland of abandoned outposts and scarred hills. Our mission: establish a forward medical station for wounded troops and incoming refugees. We believed we were fighting a conventional war against the Crimson Vulture Corps, an enemy rumored to be low on resources. What we didn't know was that they had a secret weapon, one that would change everything. We arrived in mud-streaked transports, passing artillery craters and burnt-out vehicles. Standard gear in hand, I carried my overstuffed medic's pack, filled with supplies I'd soon realize were useless. Captain Adrian Reeves, our calm and respected leader, briefed us on intelligence reports hinting at chemical weapons. There were whispers of a new gas, but no confirmed details. I wasn't alone. Corporal Maggie Diaz, a skilled medic and former humanitarian worker, had seen the fear in displaced villagers. Her humor kept us grounded, and her quick thinking made her invaluable. Then there was Private Alan Morse, the youngest in the unit, full of curiosity and unshaken by the war's weight. He asked the questions we didn't think to, and over time, I came to rely on him more than I ever expected. As we advanced into Thornhaven Valley, the old roads meandered in loops. Our vehicles kicked up clouds of dust that clung to everything. The local climate was dry, but the air felt uncomfortably thick. I thought it might be due to the smoke drifting over from recent artillery strikes. The residents who had not yet evacuated watched us with anxious expressions, peering from behind weather-beaten fences. Each civilian seemed weighed down by dread, uncertain if we were just another source of trouble. After a day of lumbering through battered roads, we finally found a location suitable for our forward operating base. We selected a compound of buildings that had once belonged to a local administrative office. The structure had high walls and a courtyard large enough to accommodate our vehicles and medical tents. Despite the emptiness of the courtyard, it provided a comforting sense of security. We immediately set up perimeter defenses, placed sandbags around vantage points, and prepared for the possibility of mortar fire from the vultures. That evening, Captain Reeves called a meeting in what used to be a conference room inside the main building. The flickering overhead lights hinted at the unreliable power supply. Soldiers crowded in, removing their helmets and wiping sweat from their faces. Some leaned against walls. The scent of stale coffee and worn boots filled the air. Reeves stood at the front with a portable projector that displayed a map of Thornhaven Valley. "All right, folks," he said in a low voice. "We've had intel that the Crimson Vulture Corps is positioned in the hills to the northeast. We're establishing this base as a staging area to treat civilians and wounded personnel. But there's another priority. Investigate claims of an experimental gas they've been developing. We don't know the composition. We do know it appears lethal. Keep your eyes open. If you spot suspicious canisters or chemical signs, inform command immediately." There was a rustle of unease through the room. Gas attacks were nothing new in warfare, but the rumor that these were not standard chemical agents left many uncertain. Lieutenant Henri Beauchamp, a tall officer from an allied unit, stepped forward to add more details. He talked about the potential of nerve agents or experimental chemicals. Still, he had no concrete evidence to share beyond the typical cautionary protocols. Wear protective masks if you see any sign of a chemical release, report unusual odors or unusual smoke, and secure the area if possible. By the time the briefing ended, I was left with a sense of foreboding that clung to the room. Nobody said it out loud, but we all felt that something was different about this. It was only a matter of hours before we found out exactly how different. Our shift began early the next day. Diaz and I were stationed in a makeshift medical tent in the compound's courtyard. The canvas dripped with dew, and the chirps of insects were the only sounds. We arranged our supplies on collapsible tables, antiseptics, gauze, IV bags, and everything else we would need for standard battlefield trauma. The day started quietly, with only a few civilians approaching for minor ailments. At midday, a sudden crackle came through the radio. Panicked voices and shouted instructions overlapped one another. Captain Reeves's voice cut through the chaos. "All units, we have a distress call from Sergeant Howe's squad. They've taken casualties in the northeastern sector. We need immediate medical support." I hurried to gather my gear while Diaz checked our supply of bandages and syringes. We loaded them into a lightly armored ambulance known as a Guardian. Private Morse joined us, along with 2 other soldiers for security. Our driver, Specialist Irene Kwan, revved the engine and tore out of the base. Dust clouded our view as we sped along a bumpy trail toward the coordinates provided. Upon arrival, we saw the remnants of a disastrous skirmish. Broken equipment and bullet casings littered the ground. The environment looked scorched, as if a sudden burst of fiery wind had swept across the terrain. Soldiers lay sprawled in defensive positions, some unmoving. Others were on their feet, but clearly rattled and disoriented. The moment we stepped out of the Guardian, an overwhelming stench invaded our senses. It didn't smell like smoke or gunpowder. It was more chemical and sharp. Our throats constricted, and eyes watered almost instantly. We found Sergeant Howe leaning against a rocky outcrop. His uniform was torn, and he was breathing in short, shallow bursts. Diaz rushed to him with a mask, trying to shield him from whatever was floating in the air. I asked him what had happened, but he seemed to struggle for the right words. "There was a canister, hidden near the ridgeline. We saw them, the vultures. They fired something into the air. We tried to fall back." Diaz grabbed a medical scanner to check his vitals. They were dropping quickly. The scanner beeped in confusion, as if it couldn't read him accurately. Whatever toxin he had inhaled was wreaking havoc in his system. I gave him an injection of a broad-spectrum antidote we used for known nerve agents. Whether it would help was unclear, because we didn't know what we were dealing with. The other soldiers in Howe's squad told conflicting stories. Some claimed they saw a greenish mist. Others insisted it was grey. All agreed it spread fast. Anyone who inhaled it, even for a second, began coughing blood. We found one soldier lying behind a cluster of boulders. He was unresponsive, but his body temperature felt extremely cold. Normally, when a person goes into shock, they can feel chilled. This was something else. It was as if a creeping numbness had overtaken him from within. Corporal Diaz and I loaded the wounded into the Guardian. Morse and the security detail provided cover. We hadn't even left the area when the first sign of something horrifying occurred. The unresponsive soldier, Private Singh, began twitching violently. Diaz tried to restrain him to prevent further injury, but he displayed an extreme level of agitation. It was like he was in a delirium. Then, out of nowhere, his eyes opened. They were glazed over, lacking any hint of recognition. He lunged. No warning. No hesitation. He nearly caught Diaz by surprise, but she managed to dodge. His movements were wild, uncoordinated yet forceful. He let out guttural noises, not words, but some distorted sound resonating from deep in his chest. The others in the vehicle scrambled, unsure how to respond. "Private Singh, calm down," Diaz yelled, but if he could even hear her, it didn't register. By reflex, Morse tried to hold him down, but Singh tossed him aside. That was the first time I noticed something truly unnatural. Despite being mortally wounded just moments ago, Private Singh displayed a surge of physical power we hadn't seen from him even in his healthiest state. His eyes locked on Diaz, and he made a frantic attempt to bite her. The security detail had no choice but to tackle him. It took 3 strong soldiers to pin him. This wasn't typical shock or delirium. Something else was driving him. We made the decision to sedate him. I reached into my bag, grabbed a syringe with a powerful tranquilizer, and injected it into his arm. Even then, his flailing continued longer than anyone thought possible. Finally, his spasms subsided, and he slumped into unconsciousness. We stared at each other in the ambulance, the hum of the engine overshadowed by our own alarmed breathing. Nobody could formulate a rational explanation for what had just occurred. Upon returning to the base, we immediately quarantined Private Singh and the other wounded who had been exposed to the gas. Captain Reeves ordered part of the compound's administrative building to be converted into a sealed containment area. Sheets of plastic were hung across doorways to isolate possible toxins. We established a decontamination procedure at the entrance, scrubbing suits, masks, and gloves with chemical wash. Lieutenant Beauchamp contacted higher command via satellite radio to report that we had encountered an unknown agent. From what we gathered, the substance was not a typical nerve gas or mustard gas. It had properties none of us recognized. Our labs were primitive, but we had to try running some tests. The results were inconclusive, except for one shocking pattern. The infected suffered rapid cellular breakdown, but then some unknown mechanism reactivated them. That evening, the situation escalated. The soldier, Private Singh, had been placed on a cot in the quarantine area. Sedatives kept him still. Diaz and I monitored him as best we could. He looked pale, his veins visible beneath his skin. When we checked his pulse, it was there but faint and erratic, as if it could stop any moment. Hours passed, and we believed he was stable enough for a short while. Around midnight, an alarm blared through the base. Shouts echoed in the corridor leading to the quarantine area. I grabbed my medic's pack and sprinted into the improvised medical wing. One of the soldiers on guard detail, Private Ross, was in a state of shock at the entrance. He stammered, He got up." I didn't even waste time with questions. Pushing open the plastic curtain, I found Private Singh standing in the corner of the room. The overhead lights flickered, giving the scene a surreal quality. He should have been asleep under the sedatives. Instead, his posture was stiff, and his head was tilted at an odd angle, as if he couldn't quite orient himself. His eyes were fixated on a nurse's aide lying on the floor. She wasn't moving. Before I could check her condition, Singh seemed to detect my presence. He pivoted, stumbling but quickly regaining balance. An unsettling growl emerged from his throat, the same kind of noise he had made in the ambulance. His complexion was ashen. A crimson stain around his mouth indicated he had done something terrible. I stepped back, calling for backup, but Singh rushed toward me. Training took over. I dodged to the side, trying not to panic. I couldn't believe how quickly he moved. 2 soldiers arrived behind me, each shouting for him to stand down. Singh didn't respond, so they tackled him, pinning him to the floor. I rushed to the nurse's aide. She was unresponsive, and her uniform was torn near the shoulder. Her pulse was gone. As the guards restrained Singh, I realized we were dealing with something more than just chemical poisoning. The toxins had turned him into a mindless creature, exhibiting aggression unlike any standard medical condition. The next question was terrifying. Could it spread? By dawn, we had 3 more cases showing similar symptoms. Each victim had come into contact with Singh's bodily fluids or had been present near the gas attack site. Captain Reeves called a staff meeting. The tension in the room was evident as soon as I stepped in. "Word from High Command is that there have been several isolated incidents of abnormal behavior on other fronts," said Reeves, pacing at the front of a dimly lit meeting area. "Our situation isn't unique." Lieutenant Beauchamp added, "The infiltration squads are bringing in more wounded, and we can't keep them all here if we're facing a rapidly spreading agent. We're short-staffed as it is." Everyone looked to me and Diaz for a medical opinion. I spoke honestly. "This is not a standard chemical weapon. It kills quickly, then reanimates the victims in some sort of frenzied state. If we assume the infection spreads through contact with bodily fluids, it could become an epidemic." Captain Reeves made the call to request immediate evacuation or reinforcements, but the lines of communication were spotty. Satellite feeds were unreliable, and rumors suggested the vultures might be using jamming techniques. With no guarantee of swift aid, we decided to fortify the base. We barricaded every entry point, posted guards at every corridor, and set up a rotation system so the entire unit could remain on high alert. Despite our precautions, more wounded arrived throughout the day. The ambulances brought in soldiers who had lost consciousness near the hill where the gas canisters were originally spotted. Some were still breathing, but showed ominous signs: skin discoloration, blank stares, or violent thrashing. We placed them in quarantine zones, but resources were limited. Corporal Diaz worked tirelessly, sorting patients by the severity of their symptoms. She tried oxygen therapy on a few, but results were negligible. Antibiotics did nothing. Even advanced antiviral medications had no effect. Every standard approach failed. Whatever this toxin was, it defied conventional medical science. Late in the afternoon, one of our perimeter guards, Specialist Kwan, who had driven us into the ambush site, started coughing uncontrollably during her shift. She was promptly rushed to me. We checked her vital signs: irregular heartbeat, shallow breathing, a fever spiking well above normal range. The look she gave me and Diaz spoke volumes. She knew her fate might be sealed. We administered everything we had, but none of it slowed the progression. The next few hours felt like an endless triage operation. The wounded poured in, some from our platoon, others from allied squads. Each time someone arrived with advanced symptoms, I braced for the worst. Meanwhile, Captain Reeves tried to manage morale, telling everyone that reinforcements would come soon. A small part of me wanted to believe him. The rest of me suspected we were on our own. Around 19 hours, we heard gunfire erupt in the southeast corner of the compound. Diaz and I were sorting supplies when the shots rang out. We grabbed our gear and rushed toward the chaos. The corridor leading to the motor pool was in disarray. Overturned crates, bullet holes in the walls, spent shell casings scattered on the floor. In the middle of it all was Private Morse, sweating and holding his rifle in a shaky grip. Opposite him, one of our own, a soldier named Lance Corporal Hathaway, stood motionless. Morse shouted an explanation. "He tried to bite me. I thought he was sick, so I tried to help him. Then he lunged. I fired a warning shot, and he stopped moving for a moment." Lance Corporal Hathaway stood about 10 feet away, head angled downward. Suddenly, he let out a raspy exhale and charged at Morse. Morse responded with bursts from his rifle, each round striking Hathaway. Yet Hathaway kept moving, only halting when a final shot connected with something vital. The entire corridor fell quiet as Hathaway dropped. I rushed forward to check for any sign of life, but found none. He had multiple wounds, any of which would have been fatal under normal circumstances. It took an astonishing amount of force to stop him. This was no ordinary infection. The gas had transformed him into an unrelenting adversary, unable to feel pain or comprehend rational commands. Captain Reeves appeared, flanked by a couple of soldiers who guarded the hallway. He took stock of the situation, then ordered a search of the entire base to see if anyone else was turning. That order may have saved lives. We found 2 more infected soldiers wandering aimlessly in remote corners of the compound, each in a daze, each oblivious to reason or fear. They resisted all attempts at restraint. Ultimately, armed guards had to contain them. The entire base was on edge, every soldier uncertain if the next cough or scratch from a comrade signaled impending doom. We hastily restructured the compound's layout. All infected individuals were moved to a separate wing, sealed off with makeshift barricades. Inside this makeshift quarantine area, we set up a system. If someone's condition deteriorated to the point of aggression, we had no option but to place them in a locked cell. We took no pleasure in this, but it was the only way to prevent the infection from spreading further. Corporal Diaz, Private Morse and I took shifts monitoring the quarantined. Some soldiers tried to keep watch through the windows, but it was a haunting sight. The infected would amble around, occasionally colliding with walls or doors, as though they were propelled by a single destructive impulse. One of the quarantined soldiers was Specialist Kwan, the driver who had first taken us to the ambush site. She was a friend, someone who used to share stories from back home. Now, each time I peered through the glass, I saw her pacing, eyes vacant, lips twitching. It was difficult to see her that way. At times, she would start to convulse, flailing like she was fighting an internal battle. Then she'd collapse, only to rise again minutes later, even more agitated. She and the others began showing advanced stages of some unstoppable progression. Captain Reeves took me aside. "We need to explore the source," he said plainly. "We can't just defend. It's only a matter of time before more of us become infected. Recon spotted more canisters in that northeastern sector. We need answers." He proposed a mission to secure a sample of the agent or its delivery system. The hope was that if we could analyze it, maybe we'd find a way to neutralize it. It sounded like a long shot, but doing nothing meant waiting for the entire base to succumb. We assembled a small team, me, Diaz, Morse, and a pair of seasoned infantrymen, Sergeant Fulton and Corporal Reyes, who knew the terrain well. Our objective was to locate any canisters or evidence near the ridgeline. It was risky, but we had no real alternative. We set out just before dusk, hoping the low light would offer some cover. The path to the ridgeline was treacherous. Winds swept across open plains, carrying faint chemical odors. My eyes stung, reminding me of the earlier gas exposure. We wore protective masks, though we weren't certain how much they would help if another canister was triggered. Sergeant Fulton led the way, scanning the horizon through binoculars. Corporal Reyes kept his rifle at the ready, focusing on the rocky terrain ahead. Morse and Diaz stayed close to me, while I clutched a small sampling kit designed to collect environmental data. We communicated in hushed voices. After about an hour of cautious travel, we spotted a stretch of craggy ground that glowed faintly under the moonlight. The soil looked tainted, covered in a sheen that was neither water nor typical mud. A harsh chemical smell surrounded the area, intensifying with each step. Then we spotted the canister. It was partially buried in debris, like a metal cylinder about 3 feet tall, with the insignia of the Crimson Vulture Corps etched into its side. We approached slowly. Sergeant Fulton signaled for silence. Reyes circled around to ensure no enemy soldiers were nearby. I knelt by the canister and extracted a sealed container from my sampling kit. As carefully as possible, I scraped residue from the canister's rim. Diaz took readings with a portable chemical analyzer, frowning at the readout. "It's reading as some kind of unknown compound," she whispered. "We're seeing elements of typical nerve agents, but also biological markers." Biological markers. That was a bad sign. It suggested the gas wasn't purely chemical. Maybe it was laced with a pathogen, something engineered to reanimate the nervous system. I didn't want to think about the implications. Morse kept an eye on the surrounding darkness. "I've got movement on the left," he said quietly, pointing to silhouettes staggering through a nearby hollow. My heart throbbed at the possibility of encountering the infected in the open. Sergeant Fulton motioned for us to hunker down. We watched from behind low rocks as a group of figures shambled through the night. Their movements were disjointed, each figure limping or dragging a limb behind. Even from our distance, something was very off. These weren't typical foot patrols. They seemed oblivious to their surroundings, except for an occasional lurch toward random sounds. One figure emitted a rasping moan, prompting the others to converge. They grouped together, forming a small pack of aimless watchers. The possibility that these were infected from earlier battles was high. As soon as one turned its head in our direction, Sergeant Fulton gestured for us to pull back. We clutched our gear, scrambled to gather the canister samples, and retreated before they could see us. We moved as quietly as possible, avoiding the luminescent patches of contaminated ground. The entire trek back felt tense, but we managed to avoid the roving infected. By the time we neared our compound, the sky was dark and distant sounds of sporadic gunfire echoed across the valley. We returned to a base in disarray. The scene that met us was worse than anything we had experienced so far. The perimeter lights flickered intermittently. Soldiers sprinted from one barricade to another, shouting for backup. Gunfire flared along the western wall, An alarm siren wailed. Captain Reeves found us near the gate. "It spread faster than we anticipated," he said. "Some of the newly quarantined turned and overwhelmed the guards. The infection is tearing through the barracks." We hurried to the medical wing, stepping over spent rounds and broken crates. Groans and guttural noises came from corridors. Shadows darted across the walls, hinting at infected soldiers trying to find their next victim. I saw a shape slump against a crate, then lunge at a passing trooper. The trooper struggled, overcame the infected, and continued running, face set in grim focus. When we finally reached the medical wing, we found Corporal Diaz's station overturned. Equipment was scattered, supplies spilled, and the quarantine area was compromised. Some of the infected had escaped. Others, such as Specialist Quan, had vanished. The plastic sheeting we'd used to seal off sections was ripped to shreds. We discovered wounded soldiers still inside, some unconscious, others in various stages of infection. Diaz knelt by one of them, a young private from another unit. He had a fresh bite wound on his forearm. She tried to treat him, but the infection was spreading at an impossible rate. He convulsed, eyes rolling back. Seconds later, he went still. Diaz looked at me, her expression bleak. Captain Reeves's voice came through on the radio. "All units, regroup at the motor pool. We're evacuating. I repeat, everyone capable of moving, regroup now." The motor pool was on the other side of the complex. We faced a gauntlet of corridors and open courtyards. Infected prowled in many of them. We formed a defensive line. Morse led in front, rifle ready, while Diaz and I stayed in the middle, providing medical attention if needed. Sergeant Fulton and Corporal Reyes covered our rear. Halfway there, we spotted Specialist Quan. She was hunched near a supply locker, uniform torn. The moment she heard us, her head snapped up, and I saw the empty gaze of someone fully lost to the infection. Her face was smeared with blood, though I tried not to think about whose it might be. She stood and jerked towards us. Morse hesitated, rifle raised. "She's one of ours," he said, voice shaky. But Quan no longer showed any recognition or reason. She charged, arms outstretched. Sergeant Fulton fired a single shot to her leg, hoping to stop her without doing lethal harm. She stumbled, but regained her balance unnaturally fast. Reyes had no choice but to fire again. Quan dropped. The corridor fell quiet except for our ragged breathing. None of us spoke for a moment. Then we continued, weighed down by the realization that mercy had no place in this fight. When we reached the motor pool, Captain Reeves was directing soldiers to load the remaining vehicles. A large transport truck and 2 guardians were being prepped for departure. He saw us and waved us over, relief briefly crossing his features at our safe arrival. Then he pointed to the ridgeline samples in my hand. "We'll try to get these to a secure lab, if we can figure out an antidote, or at least how this spreads." We scrambled to get into the vehicles. The plan was to regroup with an Allied battalion stationed 20 miles west. We had no guarantee the roads would be safe, but staying put meant certain disaster. Just as the trucks roared to life, a wave of infected soldiers burst into the motor pool. Some were our comrades. Some wore the uniforms of other Allied units. They bounded forward, unstoppable. Gunfire erupted from every direction, the clang of bullets against metal mixed with unsettling growls. One of the guardians lurched forward too soon, smashing into a stack of crates and blocking the exit briefly. Soldiers on the mounted turret fired at the swarm of infected, trying to push them back. I assisted Diaz in helping a wounded soldier get into the truck bed, even as infected hands reached for us. Captain Reeves, manning a machine gun on the lead vehicle, shouted for everyone to move out. At last, the Guardian reversed from the crates, clearing a path. We shot forward in a convoy, ramming through the gates of the compound. The infected gave chase, but we gained speed on the open road. Thornhaven Valley sprawled before us, an unsettling quiet beyond the immediate chaos. We travelled for a few miles, heading west. Our plan was to rendezvous with the Allied battalion at an old airstrip. The night sky offered little visibility, and the headlights of our vehicles felt like beacons inviting more trouble. Morse was with me in the second Guardian, scanning for threats through the windows. Diaz tried to attend to the wounded soldier we had pulled aboard, but his breathing had become shallow. He was losing consciousness fast. Before we could even reach the main highway, the lead transport truck skidded to a stop. We piled out, only to discover the reason. The road was blocked by a line of abandoned civilian vehicles, arranged haphazardly. It looked like they had been trying to flee something. Our forced halt gave the infected, who had been trailing behind us in the shadows, time to catch up. Gunfire erupted again, but in the confusion, nobody noticed that the wounded soldier Diaz was tending had stopped breathing. By the time we realized he had reanimated, it was too late. He attacked Diaz, nearly biting her arm. She escaped his grasp, but we lost a trooper who tried to defend her. The newly infected soldier was finally subdued by a volley of rounds from Morse and 2 other survivors. Each act of self-defense felt like another small fragment of our humanity was dissolving. Captain Reeves ordered everyone to clear the vehicles from the road blockade. Time was running short. We could already see infected figures emerging from behind us. With no space for complicated maneuvers, we did our best to push the abandoned cars aside or create a makeshift path. This process was loud and chaotic. Our arms ached from shoving metal and shattered glass. The stench of stale gasoline and decay filled the night air. In the middle of this frantic work, an explosion lit the sky to the east, probably the base we had just abandoned. Maybe the vultures were launching more gas attacks, or possibly the infected overran the munitions. Either way, a fiery glow lit the horizon, a grim reminder that there was no turning back. We finally managed to clear a narrow path. The vehicles surged forward, leaving the creeping infected behind. For the moment, we believed we had escaped. The battered road ahead cut through ravines and rocky hills. Our headlights bounced off the jagged terrain, revealing occasional stragglers wandering aimlessly. We gunned the engines to pass them. Suddenly, the Guardian in front swerved. The driver had spotted a massive canister lying on the road. It appeared to be the same type used by the vultures. The canister was rigged with a tripwire connected to a simple rocket-propelled launcher. Realizing too late what it was, the driver tried to steer away, but the contraption fired. A plume of smoke shot into the night sky, followed by the distinct hiss of a chemical release. I felt a wave of heat as the rocket impacted near the front vehicle. Soldiers jumped out, coughing, trying to get away from the gas. Our driver slammed on the brakes to avoid colliding with them. In the chaos, the infected lurking in the hills took advantage of our slowdown. They converged on us from multiple angles. Captain Reeves shouted over the radio, "We're pinned. Everybody hold your position and engage. Don't let them board the vehicles." Chaos reigned. Gunfire lit the darkness. The infected rushed toward us, unafraid of bullets until they were physically incapacitated. Even then, some kept clawing forward. Diaz and I tried to help the incapacitated crew from the front vehicle, but the gas had seeped into their lungs. By the time we reached them, they had started showing the same furious transformation. Sergeant Fulton and Corporal Reyes joined us, providing covering fire. One infected after another dropped, but more emerged from hidden ravines. We were outnumbered. Then, in a decisive moment, Captain Reeves made a sacrifice. He told us through the radio, "Get out of here, I'll hold them off." From my vantage point, I saw him climb onto the roof of the Guardian, machine gun in hand, unleashing a torrent of rounds into the oncoming horde. I yelled back that we couldn't leave him, but Reeves insisted. "There's no time. We don't have the numbers. Get that sample out of here." He knew the mission's priority: find a way to stop the spread. If we lost the sample, the rest of the region might be done for. Fulton dragged me back into the second Guardian. Diaz and Morse clambered in. Reyes revved the engine. We careened around the wreckage, glancing back to see Reeves still firing, the infected crowd surging around his vehicle. His final stand bought us enough time to escape. That image is burned into my memory. As dawn approached, we realized we had only a few survivors left in our vehicle. Me, Diaz, Morse, Fulton, and Reyes. Everyone else had either been infected was missing, or had sacrificed themselves to buy us precious moments. The sample canister residue we'd collected was still in my possession, but we had nowhere to analyze it. The radio was full of static, with only brief bursts of frantic calls from scattered units. We made our way to a partially ruined barn on a stretch of farmland well outside Thornhaven Valley. Exhausted, we decided to use it as a temporary safe haven. The building's walls were rotting, but it offered cover and a chance to rest. We barricaded the doors as best we could. Morse and Diaz took turns on lookout duty in the loft, scanning the fields for any sign of infected or enemy troops. Nobody spoke much. The reality of the situation hovered over us like a storm cloud. We had less than a day to come to terms with it all. Half of our platoon was gone, either devoured by the infection or turned into something monstrous. The chain of command had fallen apart in less than 24 hours. All we could do was survive and hope our faint radio signals might reach someone. Around midday, the air grew still. The farmland outside was eerily silent. We risked stepping outside to gather water from an old well. While the others prepared meager rations, I inspected the sample one more time. Without proper lab equipment, I couldn't do much. Still, I extracted a tiny swab and studied it under a handheld lens. I saw swirling fragments of something alive, something that defied categorization. A chemical agent bound to a bizarre strain of biological matter. This was what the Crimson Vulture Corps had unleashed. This was what turned ordinary soldiers into zombies. Fulton approached, his expression grim but determined. "We need to push west," he told me. "We'll keep moving until we find that allied battalion or any safe zone that can help us. If we stay here, we'll be overrun eventually." Diaz and Morse agreed. We had lost too many to give up now. It was time to move, to honor the memory of those who gave their lives, like Captain Reeves and Specialist Kwan. Rays rigged the Guardian with makeshift armor plating using sheets of corrugated metal from the barn. We packed what supplies we could. With the sample tucked carefully in my pack, we set off once more, uncertain of what awaited us. Looking back, it's astonishing how quickly civilization can unravel. In a single day, our base had fallen, dozens of comrades were lost, and the infection had spread beyond our control. By the time we reached the barn, only 24 hours had passed since that first call for a medic, yet it felt like an eternity. The Crimson Vulture Corps had engineered a gas that kills rapidly and resurrects its victims into violent husks. Their aggression is immediate, pain receptors numbed, and the infection spreads through bites and bodily fluids. Thornhaven Valley was likely doomed unless a cure or containment plan was enacted. We were just a handful of survivors, carrying a small sample of the agent and a fragile hope that the world wouldn't die in ignorance. Even with training, nobody expects an army of the undead created by chemical warfare. Standard tactics collapse. A comrade fine one moment becomes a threat the next. Hesitate, and you're dead. Now Diaz, Morse, Fulton, Rays, and I stick together, navigating abandoned roads, looking for supplies and survivors. The infection isn't contained, and the gas canisters remain hidden, waiting to spread destruction again. I record these events however I can, hoping someone finds them if I don't make it. The infection is real. The gas is potent. Stay vigilant, spread the warning, and hold on to what's left of our humanity. We survived the first 24 hours, but the battle isn't over. Our greatest weapon is knowledge. If we fail, the infection will engulf everything, turning zombie outbreak into a permanent reality. Wherever you are, learn from this. This is not just war, it's survival against something beyond understanding. We push forward, deeper into uncertainty, armed with determination and a horrifying truth. The next 24 hours will test us again. Maybe one day, we'll look back and see this as the beginning of victory, not the end of everything we knew. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.